The words landed like a strike that didn't need force to hurt. You don't belong anywhere near a table like this. The entire room at the Westbrook Grand in downtown Chicago seemed to forget how to breathe at the exact same instant, as if sound itself had been turned off without warning. Crystal chandeliers continued to glow softly above polished marble floors, but the warmth of the place had already been drained, replaced by something colder, sharper, heavier. At the center of it all stood William Carter, a billionaire CEO whose reputation for control was almost as famous as the company he built from nothing. He wasn't shouting yet, not fully, but his voice carried the kind of pressure that made people lower their eyes before they even realized they were doing it. Across from him stood Ava Johnson, a black waitress in a simple black uniform, holding a wine glass she had been about to place on the table before everything changed. Her hands were steady, though the air around her was not. She didn't speak immediately, didn't react the way people expected her to, and that silence alone began to shift something in the room. 10 feet away, a pianist's fingers froze mid-note, leaving a single suspended chord hanging in the air like it had nowhere to go. Guests who had been laughing seconds earlier now found their attention trapped, unwilling to look away but afraid to look too closely. William leaned forward slightly, his tone lowering, sharper now, more deliberate, as if trying to reduce her presence with words alone. "People like you are supposed to serve, not question anything beyond that," he said, not as an insult thrown in anger, but as a statement he believed to be factual. A few nervous chuckles broke out from a nearby table, not because it was funny, but because silence felt more dangerous. Ava finally set the glass down carefully, the soft tap of crystal against wood echoing louder than it should have. She looked at him, not defiantly, not submissively, just directly, as if measuring something invisible between them that had nothing to do with money or status. William expected her to apologize, to step back, to disappear into the background like every other time he had spoken and been obeyed without question. Instead, she remained where she was. That was the first fracture. Somewhere behind her, a manager shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing was happening. The air inside the restaurant felt tighter now, like the walls themselves were leaning inward to listen. William's jaw tightened, not from anger alone, but from something closer to irritation, an expectation being disrupted. Ava inhaled slowly, not as preparation for confrontation, but as if deciding how much of herself she was willing to reveal in a place that had never asked for it. No one noticed the subtle change in her expression except the people close enough to feel it, that almost imperceptible transition from passivity to awareness. The room, still unaware of its own turning point, waited without knowing it was already past the moment of no return. The tension in the room did not break. It deepened, like a quiet pressure building beneath glass that everyone pretended not to notice. William Carter adjusted the cuff of his tailored shirt with slow precision, a gesture that suggested he was still in control even though something in the atmosphere had already begun to shift away from him. Around the Westbrook Grand Dining Hall, conversations had died into uncomfortable fragments, small whispers that failed to form complete sentences. Ava Johnson remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, but something in her stillness was no longer passive. It was attentive, as if she had stepped slightly outside the moment and was observing it from a distance only she could access. William studied her the way people study interruptions they did not authorize, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if recalculating the situation. He was not used to silence being returned to him as an equal response. Most people filled it, apologized into it, or rushed to escape it. Ava did none of those things. Instead, she placed both hands lightly in front of her, as if grounding herself in the physical space rather than the tension filling it. A nearby guest cleared his throat, attempting to return to normal conversation, but no one followed. Even the staff seemed unsure whether to continue moving or remain frozen. William exhaled through his nose, a controlled sound that carried more frustration than volume ever could. He took a step closer, reducing the distance between authority and defiance to just a few feet. His voice lowered again, this time more measured, as though precision could restore balance. "You seem to misunderstand your position here," he said, each word carefully placed, not rushed, not emotional, but intentionally dominant. Ava finally shifted her gaze slightly, not away from him, but passed him for a brief moment, as if acknowledging something behind his words rather than reacting to them directly. That subtle movement created an unexpected discomfort in the room, as though she had refused to participate in the dynamic he had constructed. The pianist at the far end of the room slowly removed his hands from the keys entirely, surrendering to the silence. A server carrying a tray of water paused mid-step, unsure whether to continue. William noticed none of this at first. His attention remained locked on Ava, waiting for the predictable outcome he had experienced countless times before: compliance, retreat, or apology. But none arrived. Instead, Ava spoke softly, her voice steady and controlled, not raised, not sharp, but carrying a clarity that did not need amplification. The words themselves were not yet the focus, but the fact that she chose to speak at all changed the structure of the moment. It was not defiance in tone, but in timing, as though she had selected the exact instant when expectation and reality would no longer align. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the nearby tables, subtle but visible in the way people shifted their attention between her and William. William blinked once, slowly, as if recalibrating his interpretation of the situation. For the first time that evening, the room did not feel centered around him. Ava did not move after speaking. She did not retreat or advance. She simply remained in place, allowing the silence she had interrupted to settle into something new, something no longer owned by authority alone. And in that space, unnoticed by most but undeniable to those paying attention, the balance inside the room began to tilt. The silence that followed her words did not behave like an absence of sound. It behaved like a presence of its own, expanding through the Westbrook grand dining room with a weight that made even small movements feel deliberate. William Carter stood motionless for a moment longer than anyone expected, his expression controlled but no longer entirely neutral, as if he was processing a shift in a system he believed he had already mastered. Around him, guests exchanged uncertain glances, searching for cues on how to react, but no one offered direction because the usual source of certainty had not spoken again. Ava Johnson remained still, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as though the moment she had created did not require her to defend it or expand it further. That absence of reaction became its own form of pressure, because in rooms like this, silence from power was familiar, but silence from someone assumed to be powerless was not. William finally exhaled slowly, straightening his posture with a controlled motion that suggested he was attempting to reassert order without acknowledging disruption. His gaze sharpened as it returned fully to Ava, now measuring her differently, not as an inconvenience, but as an unknown variable. He took a step back, not away from her, but into a more centered position near the table, as if reclaiming the space around him through geometry rather than force. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, carefully even, the tone of someone adjusting strategy rather than emotion. He did not repeat her words, but the implication of them lingered in the way he paused between sentences, as though each pause was a calculation. Ava, meanwhile, did not move to fill the gap he left in the conversation. Instead, she briefly turned her attention to the table setting, adjusting nothing, but grounding herself in the physical reality of the environment. That small gesture created a contrast that others in the room began to notice more clearly: the difference between someone trying to control the space and someone simply existing within it without distortion. A server near the far end of the room quietly set down a tray with more care than necessary, the sound of glass touching wood unusually loud in the stillness. William's eyes tracked that movement briefly before returning again to Ava, as if he was aware that attention in the room was no longer flowing in a single direction. A memory surfaced in his mind, uninvited but sharp, of negotiations where silence had always meant hesitation from the other side, never resistance. That expectation no longer fit what he was seeing. Ava finally lifted her gaze slightly higher, not confrontational, but fully present, and in that subtle shift, the dynamic in the room adjusted again, not dramatically, but irreversibly. No one spoke to interrupt it, because no one could identify the exact moment it had begun to change shape. William's jaw tightened once, almost imperceptibly, before he composed himself again into stillness. The restaurant, once designed for elegance and control, now felt like it was waiting for something it could not predict, and in that waiting, Every person present became aware that the story unfolding in front of them was no longer following the structure they had assumed at the beginning of the evening. The stillness in the Westbrook Grand Dining Room had begun to change texture, no longer feeling like a pause in conversation, but like a suspended state of expectation that no one had explicitly agreed to, yet everyone was now trapped inside. William Carter stood with his shoulders squared, but the confidence in his posture was no longer effortless. It required maintenance, as though he was actively holding together a version of the room that was starting to slip out of alignment. Ava Johnson remained exactly where she had been, but the way people looked at her had shifted in subtle increments, no longer dismissing her presence as background movement, but quietly recalibrating it as something central. A few guests leaned slightly forward without realizing it, their attention drawn not by volume or spectacle, but by the discomfort of unresolved tension. William finally turned his head slightly toward the table, as if addressing the space itself before addressing her again. And when he spoke, his voice carried a measured restraint that suggested control was now something he had to demonstrate rather than something assumed. He did not raise his tone, because raising it would have acknowledged instability, but instead he slowed his cadence, emphasizing each word with deliberate spacing, as though structure could restore authority. Ava listened without interruption, her expression steady, neither softening nor hardening, simply present in a way that made interpretation difficult for those accustomed to predictable emotional cues. Behind her, the restaurant staff continued to move in reduced motion, trays lifted and lowered with careful precision, as if any unnecessary sound might further disturb the balance of the room. The pianist had not resumed playing, and that absence of sound now felt intentional rather than accidental, as if the environment itself had decided to observe rather than participate. William's eyes briefly shifted to the surrounding tables, noting the lack of normal engagement, the way conversations had not resumed even when opportunities had been given. That realization introduced a new layer of discomfort, not because of what was being said, but because of what was no longer responding to his presence. Ava subtly adjusted her stance, not as a reaction to him, but as a return to herself, grounding her feet more firmly, as if reclaiming physical certainty in a space that had become emotionally unstable. The distance between them, only a few feet, now felt more significant than the size of the room itself, as if it had become a boundary between two different interpretations of authority. William's expression tightened briefly, not in anger, but in recalculation, as though he was beginning to understand that the expected outcome of this interaction was no longer available to him. For the first time that evening, he did not immediately speak after another pause formed, and in that hesitation, the room registered something it had not anticipated: uncertainty from the person who usually defined certainty. Ava did not rush to fill the silence, nor did she retreat from it. She simply remained within it, as though it belonged to her just as much as anyone else. And in that shared silence, something fundamental in the atmosphere of the Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to shift without announcement, moving the entire moment closer to a point of irreversible change. William Carter exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled motion that tried to re-establish dominance over a space that no longer responded to simple authority. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room remained suspended in that uneasy balance, where silence was no longer empty, but filled with collective awareness. Ava Johnson stood across from him without shifting her position, her presence steady in a way that did not seek validation from the environment around her. William's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her again, not as a server, not as a background figure, but as an unpredictable element that had disrupted a system he was used to controlling. He adjusted his stance, placing one hand lightly on the edge of the table, a subtle attempt to anchor himself physically within the conversation. When he spoke, his tone remained composed, but there was a new layer beneath it, something closer to curiosity than command, though he would not have named it as such. The words he chose were careful, measured, designed to restore structure rather than escalate tension. Ava listened without interruption, her gaze steady, neither challenging nor yielding, simply absorbing the moment without distortion. Around them, the room remained attentive in a way that no longer felt voluntary, as if everyone present had become aware that something irreversible had already begun. A guest near the far side of the room shifted in their seat, the soft movement sounding unusually loud in the absence of conversation. The pianist had still not resumed playing, and that absence had now transformed into a kind of unspoken agreement that the evening would not continue as originally intended. William glanced briefly toward the surrounding tables again, noticing the lack of recovery in atmosphere, the failure of normal social rhythm to return. That observation seemed to register more deeply than he allowed his expression to show. Ava finally moved her hands slightly, not toward him, not in reaction, but in a small grounding motion near her waist, as if reconnecting with her own stillness rather than responding to his presence. The distance between them remained unchanged, yet it felt increasingly defined, as though it had become a line that neither side could cross without consequence. William's jaw tightened briefly, not from anger, but from the growing awareness that the expected structure of control was no longer functioning as intended. For a moment, he did not speak, allowing the silence to expand again, but this time it did not return authority to him. Instead, it settled evenly across the space, distributing itself in a way that made no one person the center of it. Ava remained calm within that silence, not resisting it, not filling it, simply existing in it with an ease that contrasted sharply with the tension around her. William's gaze lingered on her longer now, as if searching for an explanation that language had not yet provided. And in that sustained pause, the environment of the Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to shift quietly, as though the foundation of the moment itself was being rewritten without anyone announcing the change. William Carter finally broke the silence again, but this time his voice carried less certainty and more restraint, as if every word had to pass through a layer of reconsideration before leaving his mouth. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room remained unchanged in structure, yet completely altered in feeling, like a familiar place seen through a different lens that no longer aligned with expectation. Ava Johnson stood across from him without moving closer or farther away, her presence steady in a way that did not require acknowledgement from anyone in the room. William's gaze lingered on her longer than before, not with dismissal, but with a growing sense that the usual framework he relied on was no longer producing predictable results. He shifted his weight slightly, one hand leaving the table as if the surface itself no longer provided the certainty it once did. When he spoke, his tone was still controlled, but the rhythm had changed, less commanding and more deliberate, as though he was carefully testing each phrase against an invisible resistance. Ava did not interrupt, nor did she respond immediately, allowing the silence to remain intact rather than reshaping it. Around them, the guests continued to observe in stillness, no longer engaging with each other, their attention held collectively on a moment that had stopped behaving like a normal exchange. A glass was set down too carefully at a nearby table, the sound subtle but noticeable in the absence of conversation. William noticed it, but did not react outwardly, though something in his expression suggested he was aware that control was no longer distributed in the way it had been at the beginning of the evening. Ava adjusted her stance slightly, not in response to him, but in a quiet return to her own composure, as if the environment required no negotiation from her to remain stable. The distance between them, unchanged in physical measurement, now carried a different weight, no longer neutral but defined by something unspoken. William's eyes narrowed briefly, not in anger, but in evaluation, as if attempting to map a situation that no longer fit familiar patterns of authority or expectation. He paused again before speaking, and in that pause, the room did not revert to him. It simply remained still. Ava's expression did not shift, but there was a clarity in her stillness that made it difficult to interpret as submission or resistance, existing instead as something self-contained. The surrounding guests remained frozen in attention, no longer waiting for resolution in the way they normally would, but sensing that the structure of the moment had already changed beyond reversal. William exhaled once more, slower this time, and for the first time that evening, the silence did not feel like something he owned or directed. It felt shared, distributed evenly across the space, leaving no single person in control of its meaning. And within that shared stillness, the Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to hold a transformation that had not yet revealed its final form. The silence inside the Westbrook Grand Dining Room no longer behaved like an interruption in conversation, but like an entirely separate structure that had replaced the normal rules of interaction. William Carter stood in place with a posture that was still controlled, yet noticeably less certain than before, as if the confidence he had carried into the evening required continuous effort to maintain. Across from him, Ava Johnson remained steady, her presence unchanged in form but increasingly central in effect, drawing attention not through movement or sound, but through the absence of reaction. William's eyes stayed on her longer now, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a restrained precision that felt more like adjustment than command. The words came carefully, spaced in a way that suggested he was no longer trying to dominate the moment, but trying to understand what it had become. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the silence between them to extend without interruption, as if it no longer required filling to feel complete. Around them, the Westbrook Grand Dining Room remained frozen in collective awareness, with guests no longer shifting focus between conversations, but holding attention on a single unresolved point. A faint sound of glass being adjusted at a distant table briefly echoed through the room, then disappeared into stillness again, emphasizing how fragile normal movement had become in the space. William subtly shifted his stance, no longer anchored fully at the table, his hand lowering to his side, as if the physical reference point he had been using no longer provided stability. His expression tightened briefly, not with visible frustration, but with something closer to recalculation, as though he was adjusting his understanding of the environment in real time. Ava finally moved her gaze slightly, not away from him, but across the room for a moment, observing the space as a whole rather than the individual in front of her. That single motion altered the perception of distance between them, making it feel less like confrontation and more like separation between two entirely different interpretations of the same moment. William noticed it, and for the first time that evening, his silence was not strategic but reflective, as if he was no longer certain that speaking would restore what had been lost. The room remained suspended in that shared stillness, with no one willing to reintroduce normal rhythm, because it had become clear that normal no longer applied. Ava returned her focus forward without urgency, her composure unchanged, but now carrying the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to remain present in the space. William exhaled slowly, and in that breath, something unspoken shifted, not toward resolution, but toward recognition that the balance of the moment had already moved beyond its original boundaries. And in that recognition, the Westbrook Grand Dining Room held its silence a little longer, as if waiting for a version of the evening that no longer existed to finally let go. The atmosphere inside the Westbrook Grand Dining Room had reached a point where silence no longer felt like absence, but like structure, something carefully constructed by collective attention that no one was willing to disrupt. William Carter remained standing in the same position, yet the earlier confidence in his posture had softened into something more measured, as if every movement now required conscious validation. Across from him, Ava Johnson stood with the same steady composure, her presence unchanged in form but increasingly influential in how the room itself seemed to organize around her. William's gaze did not leave her, but the certainty behind that gaze continued to erode in subtle increments, replaced by an awareness that the dynamic he was used to no longer applied cleanly. When he spoke, his voice remained controlled, but the authority that usually carried beneath his words felt less automatic, more constructed, as though he was actively rebuilding it with each sentence. Ava did not interrupt or react immediately, allowing the silence between them to continue without resistance, as if she understood that forcing it would diminish its effect rather than strengthen it. Around them, the rest of the dining room remained suspended in collective observation, with guests no longer engaging in private conversation, but instead holding a shared focus on the central exchange. Even minor sounds, such as a utensil being set down or a chair shifting slightly, carried unusual weight in the absence of normal background noise. William noticed these details now, not as irrelevant background, but as indicators that the environment had stopped responding to him in predictable ways. He adjusted his stance once more, no longer anchored fully in place, as though the physical certainty of his position was no longer enough to stabilize the interaction. His expression tightened briefly, not in visible frustration, but in a deeper form of recalibration, as if he was attempting to map a situation that refused to align with previous experience. Ava finally shifted her gaze slightly downward for a brief moment, then back toward him, not as a gesture of submission or defiance, but as a neutral return to the present. That small movement created a perceptible change in how the room interpreted the distance between them, making it feel less like opposition and more like separation between two fundamentally different understandings of control. William paused again before speaking, and in that pause, he seemed to recognize that the silence he was operating within no longer belonged to him alone. Ava remained still, her composure unchanged, but the clarity in her presence suggested that she was no longer reacting to the room's expectations, but existing outside of them. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to hold its collective attention, as if waiting for the moment when the structure of the evening would either return to familiarity or fully accept its transformation into something entirely different. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room remained locked in a state that no longer resembled a normal evening service, but instead felt like a suspended moment where time itself had lost its usual direction and chosen to orbit around a single point of unresolved tension. William Carter stood in the same general position, yet his presence no longer defined the space in the way it had at the beginning of the night, as if the room had quietly stopped adjusting itself to him. Ava Johnson remained still across from him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and yet the influence of her stillness had become more noticeable than any movement in the room. William's eyes stayed fixed on her, but the certainty that usually guided his interactions continued to weaken in small, almost invisible steps, replaced by something closer to uncertainty than he would normally allow himself to acknowledge. When he spoke, his voice carried a steady tone, but the authority beneath it felt less absolute, as if it required constant reinforcement rather than existing naturally. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the silence between them to remain uninterrupted, and in doing so, she gave the silence a structure of its own that no one else in the room attempted to break. Around them, the guests continued to hold their attention on the exchange, no longer shifting between conversations or distractions, but remaining collectively focused as if the entire room had agreed, without words, that the moment unfolding in front of them was the only thing that mattered. William subtly adjusted his stance again, a small movement that suggested he was no longer fully anchored in the confidence he had entered the evening with, as though the environment itself had stopped providing familiar reference points. His expression tightened briefly, not in visible anger, but in the quiet strain of someone recalculating expectations that were no longer producing reliable outcomes. Ava's gaze lowered for a brief instant before returning forward, not as a reaction, but as a calm reorientation, as if she was choosing to remain present without engaging in the structure of dominance being projected toward her. That subtle choice shifted the perception of the room once again, making it increasingly difficult for observers to categorize the interaction in familiar terms. William paused longer than before, and in that extended pause, something unspoken became clearer, not as a resolution, but as a realization that control in its usual form was no longer functioning within this space. Ava remained composed, her stillness no longer interpreted as passivity, but as an independent state that did not require validation from anyone else in the room. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to hold its collective silence, but the nature of that silence had changed, no longer serving as a pause between actions, but as the environment in which everything else was now being redefined. The silence inside the Westbrook Grand Dining Room had reached a point where it no longer behaved like something fragile or temporary, but instead felt structured, almost architectural, as if the entire space had been rebuilt around the absence of predictable dialogue. William Carter remained standing, but the certainty that once anchored his presence had weakened further, replaced by a quiet awareness that every attempt to reassert control now required more effort than before. Ava Johnson stood across from him with the same steady composure, her expression unchanged, yet her presence had become the central reference point of the room, without her needing to move or speak again. William's gaze stayed locked on her, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a controlled rhythm that no longer fully disguised the uncertainty beneath it, as though he was carefully choosing each word to test how much influence it still carried. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to continue uninterrupted, and in doing so, she maintained a space where no one else in the room attempted to interfere or redirect the moment. Around them, the guests remained still, their attention no longer fragmented but unified, held in place by something that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition that the usual structure of authority was no longer operating as expected. William subtly adjusted his stance again, a small but noticeable movement that suggested he was no longer fully grounded in the environment he had entered with confidence, as though the physical space itself had stopped reinforcing his position. His expression tightened briefly, not in visible frustration, but in a restrained recalibration that suggested he was confronting an outcome he had not prepared for. Ava's gaze shifted slightly downward for a brief moment, then returned forward, not as a reaction to him, but as a calm recentering within the moment itself, reinforcing a presence that did not depend on external validation. That subtle shift changed the way the room perceived the interaction once again, making it increasingly clear that the exchange was no longer following the familiar structure of dominance and response. William paused longer than before, and in that pause, the silence stopped feeling like something he controlled or contained, instead becoming an environment that existed independently of him. Ava remained composed, her stillness no longer interpreted through the expectations of others, but existing as its own stable point within the room. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to hold its collective attention, but the nature of that attention had transformed, no longer focused on anticipating what would happen next, but on recognizing that something fundamental about the balance of the moment had already shifted beyond its original design. The stillness inside the Westbrook Grand Dining Room had evolved into something more defined, as if the air itself had thickened into a visible boundary that separated expectation from reality. William Carter stood in the same place, yet the confidence that once carried his presence now felt fragmented, replaced by a quieter awareness that the environment around him was no longer responding in familiar ways. Ava Johnson remained across from him with unchanged composure, but the effect of her presence had become more pronounced, not because she moved or spoke more, but because the room itself seemed to orbit around the stability she maintained. William's gaze stayed fixed, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a restrained precision that no longer fully concealed the uncertainty underneath it, as though each word was being tested against an invisible resistance before it was allowed to exist in the space. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to remain uninterrupted, and in doing so, she reinforced a structure in which no one else felt permitted to intervene. Around them, the guests continued to observe in complete stillness, their attention no longer divided but unified into a single point of focus that had replaced normal conversation. Entirely, William subtly shifted his stance again, a movement smaller than before, yet more revealing, as if even the act of standing had become less certain than it had been at the beginning of the evening. His expression tightened briefly, not in anger, but in the quiet strain of someone realizing that the framework he relied on to interpret situations was no longer producing predictable outcomes. Ava's gaze lowered for a fraction of a second before returning forward, not as hesitation, but as a controlled reset, as if she was aligning herself with a moment that no longer required external approval to remain intact. That subtle motion altered the perception of the room again, making it increasingly clear that what was unfolding could no longer be categorized within the usual boundaries of authority or compliance. William paused longer than before, and in that extended pause, the silence itself began to feel less like a void and more like a presence that belonged to neither of them exclusively. Ava remained steady, her composure unchanged, yet now carrying a quiet finality that suggested she was no longer participating in the structure of expectation surrounding her. William's eyes lingered, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that resembled recognition rather than control, as though he was beginning to understand that the outcome of this interaction would not be determined by repetition of authority. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room remained completely still, but the stillness no longer felt passive. It felt intentional, as if the entire space was waiting for a threshold to be crossed that had already been approached but not yet spoken into existence. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room had reached a point where silence no longer felt like absence, but like a complete structure in itself, holding every person in place as if the room had decided to pause reality for a reason no one fully understood. William Carter stood with minimal movement now, his earlier confidence reduced to something more restrained and careful, as though he was no longer certain that any action would produce the effect he intended. Across from him, Ava Johnson remained still, her composure unchanged, but the influence of her presence had become undeniable, not because she demanded attention, but because nothing in the room seemed able to escape it anymore. William's gaze lingered on her, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a controlled softness that suggested calculation rather than authority, as if he was now testing the weight of his own words before allowing them into the space. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to remain intact, and in doing so, she continued to define the boundaries of the moment without ever needing to assert them directly. Around them, the guests remained completely still, their focus unified in a way that had replaced all previous social behavior, as if conversation itself had been suspended by mutual agreement. William adjusted his stance slightly, a small but noticeable shift that revealed a growing awareness that the situation was no longer responding to hierarchy or expectation. His expression tightened briefly, not with visible frustration, but with the quiet realization that the structure he depended on to interpret control had begun to dissolve. Ava lowered her gaze for a brief moment before returning it forward, not as reaction, but as a calm stabilization of presence, reinforcing the sense that she was no longer operating within the same framework as those observing her. That subtle difference in posture changed the perception of the room once again, making it increasingly clear that what was unfolding could not be resolved through the usual patterns of dominance or submission. William paused longer than before, and in that pause, something unspoken became more evident, not as confrontation, but as recognition that control could no longer be assumed as a given condition of the environment. Ava remained composed, her stillness now carrying a quiet finality that suggested she was not waiting for permission from the room, nor seeking validation from it. William's eyes remained fixed, but the certainty behind his gaze had thinned further, replaced by something closer to uncertainty mixed with reluctant understanding. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to hold its collective silence, but the nature of that silence had fully transformed, no longer functioning as anticipation, but as acknowledgement that the balance of the moment had already shifted into a form that could not be reversed by familiarity alone. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room no longer felt like a place designed for conversation or dining, but like a suspended environment where every person present had become part of a single unresolved moment that refused to move forward. William Carter stood with minimal movement, his earlier posture of authority now reduced to something more measured and restrained, as though he was carefully conserving certainty rather than projecting it. Across from him, Ava Johnson remained still, her presence unchanged in form but no longer perceived as peripheral by anyone in the room, including him. William's gaze remained fixed, yet the confidence that once defined his presence had thinned into something more uncertain, replaced by a quiet recognition that the situation was no longer responding to hierarchy or expectation. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but noticeably softer, lacking the immediate certainty it had carried earlier, as if each word required reconsideration before being allowed into the space. Ava did not respond immediately, and in that absence of reaction, the silence itself seemed to stabilize into something structured and deliberate. Around them, the guests remained frozen in collective attention, no longer shifting or whispering, but fully absorbed in a moment that had stopped behaving like a social interaction and started behaving like a turning point. Williams subtly adjusted his stance again, a small motion that revealed an underlying instability in how he was now engaging with the environment, as though the room no longer reinforced his position in the way he expected. His expression tightened briefly, not with visible frustration, but with a quiet realization that the framework he relied on to interpret control was no longer functioning as reliable structure. Ava lowered her gaze for a brief moment, then returned it forward, not as response, but as final grounding, reinforcing a sense that she was no longer operating within the same system of expectation as those observing her. That subtle shift changed the perception of the entire room again, making it increasingly clear that the moment had moved beyond negotiation or correction. William paused longer than before, and in that pause, something fundamental settled across the space, not as resolution, but as recognition that the expected hierarchy had already collapsed without announcement. Ava remained composed, her stillness no longer interpreted as absence of action, but as a complete presence that required no external validation. William's eyes remained on her, but the certainty behind them had fully eroded, replaced by an awareness that control in its familiar form no longer applied. The Westbrook Grand Dining Room continued to hold its collective silence, but that silence no longer belonged to anticipation. It had become acknowledgement that what had unfolded could not be reversed, only understood in retrospect as the moment when everything quietly changed.